Navroz's professional career began in 1990, working in collaboration with me at EDF, where he played an important role in strengthening the Climate Action Network during its early days, just preceding the onset of the negotiations that produced the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, at a time when NGOs were just beginning to exert a significant influence on climate politics at the international level. Navroz went on to receive his PhD, his MA and PhD in Energy and Resources from the Berkeley Group. Subsequently, he held various positions at NGOs and in academia in the US and India before joining CPR 11 years ago. His writings continue to exert a wide influence on climate governance, and in particular, he has had a clarifying influence on my own thinking. Navroz has played a range of roles in the UN's climate activities, including a long-standing one with IPCC, where he is currently coordinating lead author to the IPCC's 6th Assessment, Chapter 13, Working Group 2. His policy-related activities at home include membership in the group that developed India's low-carbon strategy for inclusive growth and the Committee for a Long-Term Strategy for Low-Carbon Development for India. In 2015, he received the 12th TN Koshu Memorial Award for his work on Indian and global climate change governance. Of his many writings, let me point in particular to his paper, India's Energy and Emissions Future, an Interpretive Analysis of Model Scenarios, which was awarded the Emerging Regions Award for 2018 by Environmental Research Letters. The article foresees a quicker than expected transition to renewable energy for India. Today, Navroz will be discussing varieties of climate governance. Please join me in welcoming Navroz Dubash.
Thank you so much, Michael, for this very generous introduction. As Michael said, I have had the privilege of a long association with him and learned a huge amount from him over the years. And he also gave me my first break in this field, for which I always remain grateful. And I'm delighted that we're still so much in touch, Michael. So today, I had suggested I might talk about a project that is ongoing called Varieties of Climate Governance, which is a focus on the institutions of climate change. Before I get into this, let me just apologize at the outset, because this is a pretty text-heavy presentation. As I've discovered, institutions don't lend themselves to lots of pretty pictures, but I'll ask you to bear with me for this. I'm going to break up the talk into three broad parts. The first part, I really want to try and convince all of you that climate institutions matter, and we need to understand what we even mean by that term. But the first point is simply to explore this notion of climate institutions and why we should be interested in them. The second is to look at the emergence of these institutions, and there will be a focus on national climate institutions during this talk. And the third, to get a little bit of a sense of how institutions, in fact, structure climate politics and help address the challenge of climate governance. So let me start from the top and explore why, in fact, climate institutions matter. And one starting point is simply empirical. There has just been a tremendous proliferation of climate legislation, strategies, and various sorts of organizational structures over the last couple of decades. So in this graph, I want to draw your focus to the red dotted line at the top, which shows the prevalence of climate legislation and strategies as a percentage of total emissions. So at the moment, somewhere north of 80% of emissions are actually covered by legislation and strategies of some form. And behind these legislations and strategies are, of course, all sorts of organizational structures. Let me give you an example from India. So this is what India's climate structure looked like in 2007. It was pretty skimpy. There was a Ministry of Environment and Forests at the heart of it. There was some interaction with the Ministry of Power, External Affairs, and so on and so forth. Fast forward to 2014, this is what the organizational structure looks like. Now, I'm not going to go through this diagram. You're just supposed to be impressed by the number of colorful boxes that have suddenly sprung up in the intervening 7 years. But these include now bodies at the state level. They include research organizations, they include the Prime Minister's office, and they include line ministries of various sorts. And we basically came to this by filing right to information petitions and trying to find out what the composition of these formal governmental bodies look like. Now, of course, this is a very thin notion of institutions, just a bunch of boxes in an organogram. But it does lead to an interesting set of questions. Who are the people sitting in these bodies? What are the mental maps they bring to decision making? Who are they interacting with? How are they interacting with interests and shaping those interests? What are the factors that influence their decision making? All of these questions, I think, lie unanswered behind this sort of diagram. So the first point then is simply this point about the proliferation of legislation strategies and organizational structures. We need to understand really what is going on. But in addition, we need to understand, if you're going to take the Paris Agreement seriously, what are the national institutional implications of countries having got into the Paris Agreement? Now, as most of you will know, the Paris Agreement is built around this concept of nationally determined pledges. Well, how are those pledges going to be decided? They're going to be decided by a set of bodies such as those I showed for India in that organizational diagram. How will they reconcile their pledges with other national objectives? Creation of jobs, local air pollution, if you look at India, export of coal, if you look at Australia, whatever else are the sort of salient political objectives in other countries. And in coming out of the Paris Agreement, we often use this language of an ambition gap, but we also know that several countries aren't actually meeting their targets. And so we should be talking about an implementation gap. What happens when you have a pledge in place, and then you have to go towards meeting that pledge? How does that machinery actually work? How does it get amplified? What gets in the way? These are all things that are actually salient to understanding whether and how countries are going to make progress towards their pledges and ultimately address climate change. So the larger question is, how is the state being reconfigured to address climate change? Now, there's a lot of discussion now about the role of non-state actors, and of course, they're tremendously important, but I think few people would argue that the state, either in complement with or independently of non-state actors, is a really big part of the story to addressing climate change. So if we are going to address climate change, how are states in different parts of the world going about the task of reconfiguring themselves to do so? And I would suggest that this reconfiguration is needed for at least 3 reasons. For this project, we sort of tried to crystallize the challenges of climate governance. Of course, there are many aspects to this, but just to try and give it some body, there are at least three challenges that are, if not unique to climate change, that definitely are part of what makes climate change an enormous governance challenge. The first is simply the scale and scope of the issue. So as we all know, climate change cuts across and almost envelops traditional policy domains: energy policy, urbanization, agriculture, disaster management, and on and on. And in many cases, there are linkages across these domains that current institutional structures, silo-based structures in most countries, are ill-equipped to deal with. So there's an emergent language on climate policy integration, which asks what are both the frames as well as the mechanisms through which that integration occurs. So this is a little bit sort of a instrumental decision-making. How do we make better decisions through better coordination across governance structures sort of story? But I wouldn't want to leave you with the impression that we are approaching this without attention to the very deep political embedding of all these decisions. So climate change obviously brings incredibly complex politics. We have over a century and more interests that have congealed around fossil fuel-based industrialization. And in fact, industrialization has co-evolved with fossil fuels. The ways in which we think about those politics, and here I draw on a very nice Robert Cohen's address at APSA, where he talks about the political implications of these different frames. The problem looks very different if you think about this as a technological transition problem versus a mitigation problem or another possible slice on it. There are various entrenched sectoral politics that are embedded within climate change. So there's lots of papers written, for example, about energy transitions, about what happens to coal mining communities in the context of a transition out of fossil fuels. All of these are sub-themes that are of different importance in different countries, but are embedded within climate politics. And the third substantial governance challenge is the time dimension of climate change. We don't have forever to solve this problem. So science suggests not just that we have to solve it as soon as we can, but that actually there is a ticking clock here, and there is a finite carbon budget, and therefore we need rapid and transformational change, which raises the question, are states able to bring about that transformational change through using the same kinds of approaches that in the development studies literature people write about the developmental state accelerating a transformation to industrialization. Can we bring some of those ideas to bear in thinking about green developmental states? Do we see any evidence of that and the very high institutional bar that those sorts of states would have to meet? So these are I'll come back to these three challenges at the end, but this is just to set up why I think this is quite why it's important to look at how states are reconfiguring themselves. A little bit of a detour now. It's a little boring to talk about definitions, but I think it's actually conceptually really important to try and think about how we define climate institutions. So to begin with, there are a lot of definitions out there one could use for institutions, and we have chosen one that emphasizes the organizational aspect of institutions. So the formal or informal procedures, routines, norms, and conventions embedded in the organizational structure of the polity or economy. Okay, so that's how we're thinking of institutions for the purpose of this talk. But climate institutions are really hard to bound. Do we limit climate institutions to those, as some people do, for example, Mildenberger in his excellent new book, who's part of this project as well, defines climate institutions as those that intentionally focus on climate change. So that would be an easier concept to work with because it helps bound what's going on. But I think it would have a real problem that sort of sense of limits would come at the cost of what is the reality of how climate decisions are made in many parts of the world. So climate decisions in India are often made as an adjunct to energy security decisions, to air pollution decisions. In South Africa, you can't talk about climate change without also talking about jobs. And so a broader definition would be looking at climate institutions based on their effect on climate outcomes, independent of intention. So climate change might be primary or secondary or even tertiary to the objective of the outcome. So the problem with that, of course, is that it infinitely expands the scope of what we mean by climate institutions. So what we suggest here is that we focus on, instead of trying to bound institutions in a fixed way, that we look at the process of institutionalization. So climate change, as it becomes embedded within organizational structures or becomes layered onto organizational structures, becomes part of the fabric of climate institutions. So we tilt towards the more expansive view, but we use Mahoney and Thielen's categorizations of layering, drift, conversion, and displacement, by which they mean new institutions, as ways of understanding how climate institutions unfold. So this is really the part of the talk where I want to convince you that this is worth looking at. I've spent a good chunk of time on it because it's not necessarily intuitive. A lot of work in this area focuses on climate policies, and we are suggesting you need to take a step back and look at the institutional structure that underpins those policies. And so this talk is based on a project that's been going on for a couple of years. We have 8 case studies in this project, 8 country case studies, 4 developed countries, 4 developing countries, a fabulous group of authors, and a couple of very dedicated and selfless advisors, Catherine Harrison and Matt Patterson. And to bound the scope of the project, we focused on mitigation, because adaptation raises another set of issues, and we focus on national institutions, understanding that a lot of action happens at the subnational level. And the project really focuses on the two questions that I set up this talk with. How do institutions emerge? And do we have some sense of what they do in terms of solving challenges of climate governance with an eye to how they structure politics? So I'm going to go into how we think about this project and the framing of it. So the idea here is quite straightforward. At one end of this diagram is sort of a Mickey Mouse representation of climate politics. There are lots of actors involved. We're not trying to develop a theory around climate politics. People have increasingly been writing about this. But our focus is on how climate politics gets mediated by a set of factors to result in institutions of various forms, which then feed back to shape those politics. So sometimes the feedback loop happens through an institutional, through a set of institutions. Sometimes it happens in a relatively tighter loop, that first tighter loop from climate politics through these intervening variables. And these variables we've come at by scanning the literature. So the kinds of things people talk about are the role of political institutions, about narrative frames, about international drivers, and bureaucratic configurations. Okay, so now, so the way in which all the case study papers work is they basically go through the sequence of trying to understand how climate politics is mediated by these factors to result in varieties of governance and then shape politics over successive time frames. And on the basis of this, I'm going to now sort of skip straight to the punchline. On the basis of this, we've tried to map out what we feel are four broad categories of climate governance. So let me describe, and this is a slightly complicated diagram, so let me sort of dwell on it a little bit. What we're trying to say is that institutional forms are very strongly shaped by the politics, but the politics in turn is, you can also think about how it is organized along these two axes. So the first axis is how climate politics are framed. This is the one along the top of this diagram. And the de facto assumption is that climate politics have to be focused around climate mitigation. But in many parts of the world, that's not the case. It's often around co-benefits. It's around how climate change is embedded in other agendas that have greater political salience. And whether the center of gravity is mitigation-centric or embedded forms one axis. The other axis is the polarization around climate change. And by this, we mean the polarization as it tends to get expressed in electoral terms. Is this relatively low or is it quite high? And based on this, we come up with these four categories. The top left is what we're calling below the parapet. So it's where climate politics is embedded and is relatively weakly salient to national politics. The diagonally opposite point, as one might expect, is above the parapet, which is where I would put the US. To the bottom left, you have this idea of contested sectors, where you have contested institutions, but they tend to be articulated in non-climate ways, or rather in ways where climate is embedded within other agendas. And the top right are what we're calling climate consensus countries, where there is no political polarization, but a lot of political attention to mitigation per se. So now let me take you through these four types. And I hope you'll find that this typology actually helps us understand how institutions emerge and gives us a sense of how we might think about actually some of the things we care about, which is ultimately addressing climate change. So I'm going to start with the bottom right. And I'm a bit anxious about starting here because, of course, almost all of you will know more about US climate politics than I will. So I'll go over this one pretty lightly. So the US and Australia are in this category. And here, a key factor is the role of domestic political institutions. And there's an enormous, or not enormous, but a growing literature now. So people like Jared Finnegan, Matthew Mildenberger, and others are writing about how political systems, the presence and absence of veto points, whether or not you have majoritarian systems, whether or corporatist systems, and so on and so forth, whether these political institutions shape the likelihood of cooperation on climate change. And a lot of that literature has it broadly right. So in the US, the fact that you have multiple veto points in the presence of partisan politics means that you had failed efforts at climate legislation in the US. Interestingly, you also had a short-lived climate legislation in Australia, which is the other case here, and a court-enabled conversion of the US EPA in order to regulate greenhouse gases. Now, the second factor we looked at, bureaucratic configurations, end up being important in this context of heavy contestation, because bureaucratic characteristics such as a very strong US EPA, as well as strong executive bodies across the board, has enabled executive action, such as with the Obama era Clean Power Plan and so on and so forth. But of course, these were unstable and rolled back. Narratives are somewhat important to the story. There's a de facto environmental narrative, but I've often wondered what would have happened if the US had not embedded climate change quite so fully in this very toxic 20-year environmental battle that occurred. And international climate politics is relatively irrelevant to, or can occasionally be used to undermine collective action. So in the US, or in cases such as this above the parapet, institutional conversion and layering are far more likely than institutional displacement or new institutions. So much of this, I'm sure, is familiar to you. It's probably not terribly insightful. But what's interesting is when you compare it to how institutions emerge in other countries. So let me now flip to the top left box here, which is low polarization and embedded, and talk about India, where I'm on slightly firmer ground. And what you saw in India is what we're calling sectoral opportunism. So here, international pressure was absolutely key. India would not have moved if it had not wanted to be at the big boys table in the G20 and felt that without a progressive climate stance, it couldn't achieve that larger foreign policy objective. But equally important was an enabling narrative. And that enabling narrative was the emergence of this idea of co-benefits, the fact that India could achieve some of its developmental benefits while also achieving climate gains. And that actually served as a counterweight to historically what has dominated Indian climate politics, which is an equity narrative, which said, look, we didn't cause this, we shouldn't have to solve it. So co-benefits allowed a way forward politically to come up with a set of structures that India could then showcase internationally, right? So the factors were very different in India to the US. Now, once that narrative had been wrought and there was a desire to showcase something internationally, this was handed over to the bureaucratic system. So we did what Indian bureaucrats know how to do well. We came up with plans, missions, coordinating bodies of secretaries, and so on and so forth. Hence the proliferation of all those organizational boxes on the diagram. They didn't do a great deal because capacity constraints are limiting, but they did in fact create openings and spaces for enterprising bureaucrats, leading in fact to quite substantial actions, somewhat serendipitously. Political institutions, contra the earlier case of the US or Australia, don't drive institutionalization because climate politics is below the political parapet. So when I got into this whole literature and I noticed how much attention was being paid to political institutions, it didn't ring true for me here in India, which is one of the sort of reasons I did this project. I felt that the context, that the wider context globally was not sufficiently being recognized by some of the literature, and that's what we're trying to do here. So in this sort of situation, you end up seeing layering, which creates sectoral bureaucratic structures of opportunism. Now, I'm going to go through the next two a little bit quicker, just because I want to make sure I have enough time to explain the implications of all of this. If we go now to the embedded and high polarization part of the story, so I've picked South Africa of the two cases to talk about here. Again, the international moment was really important, but the international moment led to climate institutions that had very little impact on domestic decisions. So South Africa came up with a peak, plateau, and decline approach, a mitigation-focused approach, but it basically got no traction given the opposition by the monopoly electricity utility, which is called Eskom in South Africa. And so you have this two-level game. where you have sort of an international, this is Putnam's idea of a two-level game, you have an international positioning, but there has to be an overlap with sort of an agreement set in terms of domestic politics. And South Africa just didn't achieve that in the late 2000s and the early part of this past decade. And so what you ended up having was political institutions did come into play, but in ways that contested decisions in key sectors. So South African coal interests got mobilized, and the Zuma government ended up basically becoming a government strongly supported by and in bed really with coal and nuclear renter interests. Now, the narrative part of the story was really important there, because I would argue that mitigation-centric narratives just didn't resonate in South Africa politically. South Africa over the last decade and a half has been the ideas of Black economic empowerment, the idea of job creation. These are the things that really have resonated. And in the last few years, you see an emergent just transition narrative, which is tied to how you can, as in the US, in fact, how you can create jobs through a low carbon transition story. And that potentially is a much better solution to the two-level game. So in South Africa, you had these sort of unstable efforts at sectoral institutional displacement, that is at creation of new sectoral institutions that have been less than fully successful. Now, the really interesting story in some ways is the stop right story, right? So the stop right story is where I think the implicit assumption is that we're all headed, which is mitigation-centric and relatively harmonious politics. And the UK, China, and most recently Germany are perhaps cases of this. Let me tell you, here I think it's important I take you through both the UK and China a little bit quickly. In the UK, so you would not expect the UK to be a leader if you follow some of this literature on political institutions, because it is a majoritarian system, so you don't have representation from green parties and the like, which you would have in first past the post systems. It's a pluralist structure, so you don't have sort of mechanisms of corporatism for different interests to reconcile each other. But in the UK, they did in fact create the first, probably the best known, if not exactly the first, climate change act worldwide, which is organized around a top-down carbon budget approach, right? So so there's a 5-year carbon budget, and then individual departments have to actually align their actions with those budgets, and that is sort of refereed in a sense by Parliament. So the narrative of mitigation, a mitigation-focused approach was enshrined in law around the carbon budget. And a very interesting institutional innovation was the creation of a climate change committee, which was shaped by the UK's flirtation at the time with the ideas of independent regulatory bodies as a good way of governing, right? So that's the link back to bureaucratic traditions. And so now you had a machinery, an institutional machinery in place through which international pressures can be channeled, through which civil society movements like Fridays for the Future, which has been widely credited with leading to a net zero target in the UK. All of these things have been channeled through this institutional machinery. There's a way for that pressure to actually result in some outcomes through these levers, and I'll come back to that in a second. China is another interesting case where, as with India, international pressures were actually key, and narratives were really key. So China moved from a very India-like equity narrative to a co-benefits narrative, to its latest narrative, which is about ecological civilization, which says we are going to move to high value added industry as a way of creating jobs, and also because we believe our current manufacturing-led approach is not sustainable. Now, of course, it's also very helpful that that narrative is consistent with building a renewable energy industry and renewable energy exports and so on and so forth. In China, the way in which this is achieved very much follows existing bureaucratic furrows. 5-year plans, national leading groups, the assignment of responsibility to its planning body, the NDRC, which has an enormous amount of authority over line agencies. So China is the most densely institutionalized climate structure. They actually have direct lines of controls from the NBRC to line departments and from there down to the provinces. Now, of course, it doesn't always work seamlessly, but there are very clear chains of authority. And so over time, you have had a series of new institutional developments in China, and these have happened in lockstep with public narratives. So what we see here then are these four broad and very different kinds of climate institutions. And the message I really wanted you to take away from this is that there are, in fact, multiple varieties. I'm going to put this slide back up here for a second. There are these multiple varieties of climate governance. You don't start with a blank slate in creating climate institutions. You're very much shaped by the factors I talked about, which operate differentially in different countries: political institutions, narratives, international pressures, bureaucratic configurations. And the institutions very much follow the politics in a sense. But as we'll see in a minute, it's not that the politics is invariant. The politics can also be shaped by the institutions. So this is our effort to provide the starting point of an answer of how climate institutions emerge. And in the time I have left, I just want to try and take you through very quickly a few ideas on what happens when these institutions are actually put into play. What happens to climate institutions in practice in these countries? I will say that this whole project is very inductive. And so this is by no means an expansive survey of how these institutions have worked. And in many cases, there are relatively new institutions, but we get a few glimmers of the sorts of things that they can do. So if you remember, I had suggested there were three broad challenges of climate governance. The first of which is tied to the scale and scope of climate change as an issue. And what we see is that in these 8 countries, there are relatively few countries that have found lasting solutions to this challenge of coordination. In many countries, the starting point is just to dump this with environment ministries. And that has not proved to be a good idea. Environment ministries typically don't carry much heft in just about any country in the world. Power ministries aren't going to listen to them. Urban development ministries aren't going to listen to them, and so on and so forth. The next step then are these coordination committees, where you bring representatives of all the ministries and you place them under a prime minister's office or in some sort of commission of some sort. And what happens is that those hierarchies tend to be reproduced. So these committees have also not been a great way of actually reconciling and bringing together agendas across different sectoral silos. And the only times that you've seen this coordination problem substantially solved are in what we're calling the climate consensus countries, the UK, Germany, China, where because there are new legislative instruments that set a clear frame for the interaction across different sectoral interests, it enables a better shot at that sort of coordination. Now, the framework that I laid out also, I think, suggests a very interesting question, right? Is it premature for a country to try and create mitigation-centric institutions like a new climate law with targets and timetables and so on and so forth, when the politics aren't really sufficiently mature, when you have the kind of partisan politics that we've seen in the US and Australia with the flip-flopping that we've seen? Because these mitigation-centric institutions have only worked in a sense where there is sufficient consensus on climate politics to sustain those institutions over some time. And there's a real question here as to whether sectoral, more under the radar efforts at institutions, which is why it's important to have that broader definition of what we mean by climate institutions. So climate institutions include organizations and structures aimed at energy transformation, for example, or at technology development or whatever else it might be. Maybe when the politics is insufficiently mature, that's what you have to work with. It's a proposition that comes out of this, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. What we also see are what we're calling beachhead institutions. So for example, in Australia, they created a set of very small renewable energy promotion bodies, which were allowed to continue despite the flip-flop when Tony Abbott's party came into power. And those bodies have over time built a constituency and provided an avenue for the subnational level, for the provinces in Australia to actually undertake a renewable energy transition. So it's not the case that it's an either or. You can have these sort of intermediary institutions. And in India as well, you created renewable energy, a renewable energy mission that actually opened the door to what has become now the second largest renewable energy, the country that adds the second largest amount of renewable energy every year to its grid. So the coordination challenge hasn't fully been solved, but you see a few interesting openings. But I think the most intriguing part of it for me is, should one be much more strategic about the kinds of institutions you're building, given the kinds of politics one has? That to me is the question that this part of the discussion leaves me with. The second governance challenge, large governance challenge we talked about, was mediating politics, right? All the complex politics of climate change. And what we've seen is that very few countries have set in place institutions that are about imposing costs in the interest of mitigation. There have been a lot more successful benefit sharing institutions. I mentioned the renewable energy promotion bodies in Australia and India. Those are good examples of benefit sharing institutions. They're doling out subsidies, what's not to like, right? So those have had some longevity. At the same time, there's a real question as to whether institutions can, over time, shift politics. Have we seen any instances of that? And the UK provides probably the clearest case of this. So despite the fact that the UK has this act, it has stood the test of time, there has been pushback at key moments. For example, at the 5-yearly budget setting moment, there was organized resistance. Is the budget too stringent, and so on and so forth. At that point, the UK Climate Change Committee, which puts out lots and lots of credible analysis and is very well networked, was able to put out analysis that buttressed the articulation of a new and quite stringent budget, right? So the institution, in a sense, acted as a political ratchet to prevent that kind of backsliding. And I think that's a very important role that they can play. A third point and a second role is the creation of deliberative bodies. The German tradition of Enquete commissions, where they bring together people in the German corporatist tradition to try and, so bringing together members of parliament with experts, members of parliament from across the aisle with experts of different stripes to try and sort of hammer out an agreement, has proved to be a very successful institutional structure. And similarly, the Brazilian NGO Forum, which is a very long-standing body bringing together NGOs and others, has often led to a lot of interesting ideas, was part of the creation of Brazil's NDC, Nationally Determined Contribution, at Paris, but it hasn't been powerful enough to really provide enough of a bulwark against the pushback that President Bolsonaro has attempted in Brazilian climate policy and policy making. So a bit of a mixed story. We can see the promise of institutions. We don't see the actualization of that promise in too many cases when it comes to mediating complex politics. The weakest part of the story is really whether we have institutions around strategic intent and transformation. Do we have any proto-green developmental states? And the answer is really very limited. I've suggested that where climate politics may not be that harmonious, you could maybe put in place sectoral institutions to move things along, to create, for example, accelerate renewable energy, create public transport as part of urbanization processes in rapidly changing countries, and so on and so forth. So that sort of sectoral opportunism is a productive way forward, but climate science says that there are limits to that sectoral opportunism. If at some point you aren't benchmarking what you're doing to what is required by science, and countries don't build the bodies that allow them to do that benchmarking, we're going to fall short. So what is a sobering message is that implicit in the Paris Agreement is that countries are assumed to have ratcheting institutions that will do the job of mediating interests and creating a truly nationally determined contribution that is politically sustainable, that then is implemented, and that is then monitored, tracked, and every 5 years is then updated and strengthened. The bodies that would be required to do that really exist perhaps only in the UK, China, and Germany from among our cases. Going one notch further, thinking about a state that has the ability to actually be transformative, maybe China is the only case, at least its stated objective of ecological civilization seems to point in that direction. So where we come out on these climate governance stories is coordination. Yes, some things have happened, but you haven't seen lasting bodies. You see benefit distributing institutions, but very few cost allocating institutions. And so you're not really biting the political bullet. And you see very little strategic change or bodies that can bring about or force that strategic change. So it's not the most heartening story in terms of what we see in the functioning of climate institutions. So let me just wrap up in the last couple of minutes that I have with the few points that I'd like to leave you with. I want to start by saying this is an effort to kind of open up a space for conversation. This is by no means the last word, far from it. It's meant to open up that space. And I would suggest that we just aren't thinking about this enough. How are states reconfiguring themselves to address climate change? Because they'll have to if we have to bring about the kind of transformation that science tells us we need. So institutions are a blind spot in the climate research agenda. And I would suggest that we collectively resist a narrow construction of climate institutions, which is only focused on mitigation, because the politics suggests that in many countries, climate mitigation comes as an adjunct to a set of other things. Second point I would share is that climate institutions come in different varieties that map to national climate politics. And there's a sequencing decision here. Does one start with mitigation-centric institutions or these kind of sorts of embedded institutions? And how do these institutions, even if they're embedded, occasionally they can help shift politics over time. And another thing that can shift that politics is the creative use of narratives, right? So the idea of a just transition, a Green New Deal, all of these are different ways of shaking up well-worn political configurations. And the final sobering point is that there are few cases of, to put it perhaps overly strongly, Paris-compatible climate institutions. But we have to see some consistency between the Paris pledges and institutions if we want to believe those pledges. So if a country tells you that they're going to aim at a net zero target and they don't have any mechanisms behind that to track how they get there, design how they get there, and so on and so forth, one has to ask hard questions. And we have to ask these questions in particular because while we may start with sectoral and opportunistic institutional pathways, which is what most countries have done, including my own, we have to move beyond that ultimately to things that are more strategic and more tied to the kinds of transformative changes that science tells us we need. So I hope this encourages more conversation about climate institutions and governance, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks very much. Michael, can I hand it back to you?
Yes, I just thank you for a terrific talk, by the way, very sweeping and insightful. But I do have a question, and I want you to leave us with some optimism, please. One of the, it's been argued for a long time that co-benefits is a sure route into solving the climate problem because, as you argue, it sort of helps resolve a lot of domestic issues. On the other hand, the counter argument is if co-benefits were that great and would have achieved a lot of emissions progress, we would have achieved the progress already, and we haven't, so it clearly isn't enough. And part of what's lacking is, as Scott Barrett would argue, that there's, with the co-benefits argument, there's a lack of any real crunch to cooperation at the international level. There's no enforcement, essentially, aside than what you get at the domestic level anyway. So where do you wind up with this, essentially? Are we going to just sort of stumble along until things get so bad that, countries get, like the US, China, get so serious that they're really willing to strong arm everybody else? What's the ultimate path that gets us away from just doing what we would have done anyway?
Okay, tough question, Michael. Should I go ahead and answer that, or do you want to? Should I take a crack at it?
I'd love to hear an answer if it's uplifting.
Well, okay, I can't overpromise. So, as you know, Michael, I have long sort of advocated the co-benefit story, but ironically, in this talk, I'm sort of saying, look, that can only get us so far, right? But I would argue that in failing to actually double down on to actually take seriously the co-benefits logic, we've spent a lot of time creating a gaming dynamic, right? So for a country like India, now that, in a sense, India hasn't really shifted its climate politics very much. The rest of the world has just gone into reverse. So suddenly India is like looking like a climate leader. We haven't actually changed anything we do. So we are actually empowered to follow that co-benefits path to its logical conclusion. Ironically, we even are promoting renewable energy and opening the door to coal investment simultaneously, because we feel that we're so untouchable at this point, which is sort of ridiculous. But I guess the point I would make is that the sort of, crossing the river by feeling the stones approach hasn't really been tried sufficiently. And where it has tried, it has led to a lot of changes and what political scientists would call the sort of feedback loops, where you then lead to creation of interests who then articulate for further attention to the things that they care about, in this case, the renewable energy interests. That story has really played out in India. And I think it's played out in a few other countries as well. I think following that story to its logical conclusion would make it much easier over time to move to more mitigation-centric interests. And what we've done instead is say, precisely because we don't have time to follow the co-benefit story and it's unpredictable, we're going to try and force the system into a mitigation-first construct. But the politics don't allow for the mitigation-first construct. And so in practice, we've actually done neither. So that's sort of, so I sort of feel like, if I had to rewind the clock back to when you and I were, when I was sort of learning at your feet in 1992, we should have taken pledge and review back then, because then we would have actually taken a stab at seeing what worked within domestic national constraints. And we would have had 30 years to figure that out instead of 3.
Good answer.
Wonderful. So I have a few people queued up here with some questions. And so the first person that we'll go to is Hélène Benveniste. Hélène, would you like to ask one of your questions?
Yes, Navroz, thank you so much for this very interesting talk. I guess my question relates to the role of national narratives around climate change that you have been mentioning. You mentioned that some of those narratives have played a crucial role on institution building in at least some of the countries that this project studies. I was wondering whether you could comment more on the relative importance of narratives in the different countries, and whether you could say if this project actually includes a comparative analysis of how those narratives came about, so kind of more upstream level. And I guess I have a second question on a different point, if you have time, that relates to what you mentioned at the end about the apparent mismatch between how institutions are set up in different countries and this pledge and review mechanism that doesn't fit with a lot of countries. I was wondering whether the UNFCCC would consider including monitoring efforts to look at how each country develops its national climate institutions, and do you think that would be a good idea or actually not relevant in this context? Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. If I could, I might just take the second question first. I think that we're at a point now, of course, that you know, everybody is placing their optimism and their wishes on the US and Joe Biden's and Kamala Harris's shoulders. Everybody's looking at what countries might say in their next round of pledges.
Yeah.
And what everybody's asking for is a net zero target. And this is a little iconoclastic, but you know, I really worry that a net zero target for some distant point in the future, without a mechanism to meet that net zero target that is credible in the present, may not actually do that much. And so I would love to see actually NDCs, including pledges tied to institutional mechanisms. You know, are you going to create a law? Are you going to create a monitoring structure? Are you going to create some sort of deliberative body that tries to sort of reconcile interests in key transforming sectors? And I just will say, in passing with my sort of policy wonk hat on, COP26 is being convened by the UK, which has been aggressively promoting its model, which is built around the Climate Change Committee and the Climate Change Act. And really, the UK we should be whispering this in people's ears, saying, look, you know, if you guys set up an institutional structure, we'll make sure that you get brownie points for doing it. And I think would actually make a difference. So broadly, I agree with your thought, what I understand to be your thought process, and thank you for that question. On the narratives side of the story, you know, so what the papers do is they try and sort of look historically at the emergence of institutions and how these factors interplay. And in a couple of cases, you find that the narrative really has got in the way, and a shift in the narrative has kind of unlocked change. Let me talk about South Africa as an example. So the mitigation narrative, which was created by a bunch of policy entrepreneurs, they came up with this mantra of peak, plateau, and decline. They did models and so on and so forth. And it basically became very obvious that to follow that peak, plateau, and decline mitigation trajectory would dramatically threaten ESCOM. It would threaten the coal interests. And those interests had not paid attention to climate change until South Africa put something pretty ambitious on the table at Durban when they held the COP. And then they got mobilized, and the next 7 or 8 years was basically the Zuma years, when climate change didn't make a dent at all in what, you know, South African academics call the minerals energy complex. And it is only more recently that under new leadership, they're trying to craft a just transition narrative that talks about how you put jobs first and embed a low carbon economy within that larger story of a transition out of a coal-based and fossil fuel-led economy. So that effort to build a new narrative, I think, is far more hopeful. And then you sort of and then building institutions and policies around that narrative, I think, has far greater chance of success in South Africa.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Next, we will go to Bob Cohane, who also has a question.
Thanks very much, Navroz. That was very interesting talk. It was a great talk and very challenging. I think you can make more of the narratives point. Your 2x2 should have narratives that are plausible or not plausible. I think it'd be more powerful 2x2. But it's your challenging question was, is it premature to establish a mitigation-centered institution if there's not a consensus? What you're basically saying is, should the U.S. have an EPA, have a strong EPA? And I think you're throwing the towel way too soon. And I think you're throwing the towel at the wrong time, just when we're about to make some progress. And it seems to me that we need to pay more attention to decisions by investors and businesses. Let's look at what the EPA decisions under Obama did, the Clean Power Plan and so on. It changed expectations for investors now very strikingly on Wall Street and many firms. And in the long run, they're not going to get away with a high carbon economy. So whatever the fluctuations are in the U.S. unpredictable political system, these corporations have much more consistent long-term planning than the government. And if government action, even if it's sporadic, is going to shift the trajectory of long-term planning by investors and by the major industrial corporations, it'll make a big difference.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Cohen. So I would far be it for me to throw any cold water on any of my US friends this week. You know, I celebrate along with the rest of you. I would simply come back to the starting point of your question. I'm not sure that I would read into what I said that the US shouldn't have a strong EPA. In fact, the EPA, Matthew Millenberg, who does the paper on the US, makes the argument that the US actually ends up doing a lot more than other countries because of the conversion of the US EPA, thanks to the endangerment finding, into a body that can take on climate mitigation. I think that's right. So you know, he kind of contests the idea that the US is actually a weak climate player because of all this latent capacity. I guess what I'm challenging is the idea that the success of a Biden-Harris administration will be judged by whether they push through climate legislation, qua climate legislation. So you need to empower the EPA in ways and through constructs that avoid the you know, poking the bear in the context of the sort of partisan conflict that we've seen around environmental framings of the issue. So take a page from your book, you know, a technological framing. The US is way ahead if you think about climate change as a technology challenge, you know, battery storage technology, building and sending those signals to investors and businesses. So it's less about, so the institution can be harnessed under the umbrella of different sorts of narratives and bringing together different sorts of interests. And I think the US is a case where creative use of alternative narratives, and the Green New Deal may be a bridge too far, but different forms of narratives would allow the EPA to do its work in a more unhindered format than you know, even if you end up with 2 senators in Georgia and have a narrow majority in the Senate, climate legislation is probably not the way to go. And I would argue that maybe some of our friends in the environmental community were a little bit too dogged about it all these years. There should have been slightly more indirect strategies that had the effect of mitigation without necessarily taking on mitigation as the ultimate. You know, you have to. I sometimes feel with my friends in the environmental movement, as Michael knew, I've come out of the U.S. environmental movement, that it didn't matter so much what you did, but you had to be seen to be doing it, or you had to say you were doing it, and that's just bad politics. Is the point that I would make.
Makes lots of sense. I'm not sure you can hear me, but it seems to me that makes sense. The big mistake was that I think that the answer was tax and spend. That was the wrong answer. That was exactly the wrong thing to do. It didn't create winners. It just created losers, and it runs right against the U.S. political narrative. That was I think a disaster. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, but just to reinforce, I certainly wouldn't argue for a weaker EPA. That wouldn't be the message of the story. It's finding creative ways of actually unlocking the EPA's and other bodies' latent capacities. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Thank you.
So I think we have to close it out now because we've reached our time. You're visiting with other people this afternoon, Navroz, isn't that right? I thank you for a really engaging talk, a challenging talk, and one that, as any good talk should be, doesn't present any easy answers to a complicated problem, but at least proposes a way to look at the problem, which is somewhat more promising than it has appeared to many of us lately. So I hope everyone will join me in thanking Navroz for joining us today. Thank you.